Shabbat Shalom. It's good to know that no matter what size room we're in, that people will sit in their seats. So we walked in, there were like 5 people before services started, and someone said, wow, it's going to be a smaller crowd tonight because there's no bar mitzvah or anything. And I was like, great, well then why don't you sit closer? He said no. So it's good to see that people are sitting still in the very last row of the sanctuary, and no one in the very front row. So it doesn't work like that on the airplane, where everyone wants to sit in first class, and there's plenty of legroom up here, I'm letting you know. But also mazel tov to all the graduates and your families, that it really is an accomplishment and a celebration, that obviously there are far more graduates than were here for the Aliyah, but you get extra credit. Like if we could give you an extra tassel for your hat, you would get that. But what I wanted to talk about this morning, and thank you to the Rabbi for her very kind and generous words. Now I feel like officially like a mensch on the bench. They have those, so, or whatever a mensch in the pews would be, right? So, but what I want to talk about is this Mother's Day weekend, and so one, don't forget it's Mother's Day weekend. You have 24 hours or so to go pick up some flowers or something like that, and we all have mothers. That you wouldn't be here. We all have mothers. Not all of us are mothers ourselves or parents, but I like the idea that we all have mothers. Actually, one time, I remember I was in college, school had finished and I was up at my friend Dave's house up in Providence. We had remembered that it was Mother's Day, so I quickly called FTD, I think that was the flower company, and I sent my mom some flowers in San Francisco. She was so appreciative the next day when they arrived. It was terrific, and I got all of the accolades, and I got to make fun of my sisters who did not send flowers. And then 3 weeks later, she's like, "Did you charge something to me?" And I said, "It's the thought that counts, Mom." And to this day, she says the same thing. So, but I want to focus not on our mothers, excuse me, but on our grandmothers, right? So I grew up very close with my grandmothers. That at first I grew up in Northern California and they were in Southern California, but then they moved up north eventually. And so by the time I was in high school, definitely, probably middle school, high school, in my memory, every Sunday morning, they would come over for like bagels and stuff on Sunday morning, as Jews eat. And every Sunday evening, they would come over for a barbecue. Now, it is not likely that they came over for breakfast and dinner every single week, but it was with frequency that they were there, and I was able to ride my bike to their apartments, and so I have very strong connections with my grandmothers and the one grandfather whose name was Ben, who my Ben is named for. Very strong memories. How many people grew up close to a grandparent? Great. So about half the people, right? So you understand what I'm saying, to be able to be so close, and for them to just be a regular part of your life. But interestingly, there are very, very few references to grandparents in the Torah. Now, this morning, I just looked again at the earlier part of Genesis, because they were certainly the multiple generations, or, this begat, then they begat that and begat them. And there's the whole list of names, but there's no scene in either with Adam, and there's no scene with Noah that they actually interacted with each other, even though they were living for hundreds and hundreds of years. So obviously there were multiple generations living at the same time, but there was no scene of interaction until we get to the end of Genesis. So I brought that here. Genesis 48 is the first scene that we have of a grandparent, and it is Jacob meeting his grandkids, Manasseh and Ephraim. It's a significant scene for the most part because when we bless sons on Friday night, we bless them, that you should be like Ephraim and Manasseh, right? But it's not a meaningful grandpa type experience that we have here. And I should say that there's not a grandma scene. And so the Torah is a little bereft of a grandma scene. But for the grandpa scene, and you could read this scene on your own, but we see that, let's start at verse 9 here. So this is Genesis 48, verse 9. And Joseph says to his father, so remember it's Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and then Joseph. And right, so this is Jacob's son says to his father. Joseph says to his father Jacob, they are my sons whom God has given me here. Jacob says, bring them up to me that I may bless them. And now Israel, Jacob's eyes were dim with age. He could not see. So Joseph brought them close to him, and Jacob kissed them and embraced them. And Israel said to Joseph, so father says to son, I never expected to see you again, and here God has let me see your children as well. Right, so it's a moment of gratitude, of gratefulness, of a grandfather being allowed to see. Of course, Jacob thought that Joseph was dead, right? Remember the play, all that, right? And so he has just extreme gratitude. A few chapters later in Genesis 50, we see the focus is on Joseph now. And Joseph actually has a full experience of grandparenting. Joseph lived to see the children of the third generation of Ephraim. Right, so the third generation of Ephraim, some say that was 3 generations. Some say that included Ephraim, his son, and then 3 additional generations, which would make it 4 generations. But now we've gone from no scenes of grandparenthood to great or great-great grandparenting. So Joseph lived to see the children of the third generation of Ephraim. The children of Machir, son of Manasseh, were likewise born upon Joseph's knees. And the rabbinic commentators say that Joseph was an active grandparent, that they grew up with him. And we assume that means that they were all very close by. That Chizkuni in the 13th century sort of expands on this or clarifies for us that Joseph only saw Ephraim's grandchildren on one side, whereas he did live to see Manasseh's great-grandchildren, which means that it's Joseph's great-great-grandchildren, right? A lot of generations. But again, even though we see the grandfathers, the grandmothers are absent from it. But I want to ask you, tell me about your grandmother. So my grandmother, Matilda and Pauline, they were big grandma and little grandma. So big grandma was probably 5'3". And so I can't imagine what size little grandma was. And they were incredible parts. For a while, Big Grandma actually lived with my parents. And that act of kavod av'eim, kibud av'eim, of honoring your parents, is something that I hold, because the obligation is for a child to bring honor to their parents, but to have it modeled for me as to how to treat a grandparent, how to treat a parent, is something that I carry with me. That my sisters and I, of course, joke about, who's going to get mom. And then we also say it with affection of who's going to be able to get mom when the time comes. Until then, she's traveling the world and doing everything that she can. But the relationship of a grandparent to a grandchild is different than a parent, right? How is being a grandparent different than being a parent? You don't have to discipline. So Mark says, right, you don't have to discipline, right? Grandparents' job is to just say yes, right? And leave it up to the parents. So, Glenda? You don't, well, I'm going to rephrase it a little bit. Glenda says that you don't have to worry about the long-term consequences. You don't have to walk around with the angst of that, right? As parents, we just walk around with a lot of angst, like what happens with this and what are the implications of that? And are they going to graduate high school? And are they going to go to any college at all? Or are they just going to live in our basement forever? Well, the reality is that they will go to college and they'll probably live in your basement too. Right, yes, and so grandparents don't have to walk around with the same type of angst parents think. I think that they probably have a different angst. Yes, a grandfather.
Being a grandparent is fun. In fact, we had our granddaughter over last night, and it was just absolutely wonderful. But, and I wouldn't give it up for anything, but there is a bit of consternation in that you can't tell your children how to raise their children.
Ah.
We want our parents telling us how to raise ours.
So Craig says that it is just filled with joy. It is the best thing ever to be a grandparent. And also, you have to know when to shut your mouth. That, just as you didn't, your mother's behind you, I'm not commenting on, but there's a big smile, which I assume means that he loves all of the advice that's lovingly given. So, there was a lot going on right there. But Craig was saying that you have to know, just like you don't want your parents to tell you what to do, the grandparent also can't tell their kids what to do. Right. Right, exactly. So, yeah.
It seems to me, my parents and my in-laws as well, they have the gift of, and I don't mean this in the sort of classic way, they have the gift of time and perspective. So they have the gift of seeing the family grow from the perspective of having already been parents and having seen so much more than even their children and their grandchildren have seen, and the appreciation of the next generation. Like when Joseph says that when Israel says that he didn't see Joseph again, and now he sees his children, it's like this incredible arc that's been created that he's able to see much farther to the end of this arc than he thought his life would go, and his legacy would extend. And so that perspective, I think, is only the grandparents and great-grandparents can hold it.
So the Chazan is saying, if I capture it correctly, that being a grandparent gives you a different time horizon, right? So Jacob thought that, now Jacob has other kids, and this is part of the whole dysfunction in that family, but he was betting on Joseph. And and this is a Dayenu moment, like I never thought that I would see Joseph. Dayenu, if I'd only seen Joseph, it would have been enough. And yet I'm seeing Joseph and my grandkids through Joseph. And that maybe gives Jacob a greater sense of continuity in life. Yeah. So do you know what, we all know what TED Talks are, right? So there's a Jewish version of TED Talks called Eli Talks. It sounds like a joke, but it's actually true, like ELI Talks. And they're terrific. Actually, I think your brother did an Eli Talk before. And so I would definitely recommend it. So here's one by Jane Shapiro, gave an Eli Talk about her experience of bubbyhood. She calls it the Torah of bubbyhood, and this is on the backside. So she offers 3 pieces of advice for the key to being a successful grandmother or a grandparent generally. And so let's run through this and see if it resonates for those that are grandparents or parents, but we're all grandchildren at some point in our life. So the first, and I think this builds off of what Craig was saying, is tzimtzum. That tzimtzum is the Kabbalistic idea that God, in order to create space for creation had to withdraw God's self to actually make physical space in the galaxy for stars and planets and trees and animals and all of those things. But if God's Spirit fills the entire world, then God needed to withdraw to leave space for a new creation. So it is often that a grandparent might at first and later feel that they need to jump in and parent themselves. Right? But they actually have to learn this concept of withdrawing. So the example that she gives is from the book of Ruth, where Ruth has a child at the end. This is in chapter 4. Ruth has a child, and Naomi is so excited to be a grandparent, right, that the talk of the town is actually that Naomi had a child. Naomi had a child, which was not the case at all, but maybe that was a little bit of an over-involved grandmother in what was going on, where even the gossip around was that Ruth, who had given birth, that it was actually Naomi's child. But so for Tzimtzum, reflect on the idea of you need to create space for your children to create themselves, right? And for them to parent. Is that something that you've experienced or resonates with you? As I'm looking at Jeff closely hugging two of the many grandchildren, yeah?
So sure, being a grandparent means that we were all parents. And as parents, we all make mistakes.
Mm-hmm.
And being a grandparent gives us the opportunity of that second chance, of learning from our mistakes, of how we should have or may have altered the way we raised them.
Okay, let me just stop you there, because that is the opposite of tzimtzum, what you just described. So what Jeff said is that by being a grandparent, it means that you were a parent first, and you made mistakes because there's no manual, and you said that being a grandparent allows you to correct the mistakes that you made, which is the opposite, because you are not the parent. You're Naomi, what you just described.
Well, it doesn't mean having the ultimate say, but it means giving a mentorship, being a mentor, being a guiding force.
Yeah.
So that you can create the legacy.
Yeah.
This is the time to do it.
So you get to help, you get to mentor, you said, your kids on how they might, because you made mistakes, because we all make mistakes.
And mentor my grandchildren.
And that is really the gift, that you get to mentor your grandkids in a different relationship, like where we started, that you aren't the one responsible for the discipline in that same way. Let me ask your grandkids, any advice? How much do you love coming to shul with your grandpa every week? This much or this much? Okay, good job, Jeff, right? That's it. So the first one is tzimtzum. As a grandparent, we need to withdraw ourselves to create space. The second, and this is exactly the jumping off point, is Zman Kodesh, right? Earmarked, specially designated time with your grandchild, right? So here we see it on Shabbos morning, right? But that you need to carve out purposeful, intentional time between grandparent and grandchild. So those that grew up close to your grandparent, can you share a memory of what here might be called Zman Kodesh, but of special time with your grandfather or grandmother? Glenda? Sleeping over at their house. Yeah, sleeping over at their house. Yeah, Jonathan.
When I was a child, I was very, very interested in trains and transportation. And my maternal grandparents lived in Boston, which had an extensive subway system even then. When I went to visit, my grandmother would frequently take me to ride every subway line.
Jonathan shares that as a kid, he was really interested in trains and transportation, and that his grandparents would take him on every metro line, or I guess it's the T up in Boston, or whatever. They would just follow your interest and your passion, and that's a great memory. And yes?
After school on Fridays, when my grandma would take me home for Shabbat dinner at her house.
Great. Tessa said that that her grandma picks her up at school, and they go over there every Friday night or many Friday nights for Shabbos dinner. That's actively happening now. So it's amazing. So that's beautiful. So let's be purposeful about our time. And then the last is what she calls bubamaises. So a lot of times when we call it bubamaises, they are just folklore. But here she's calling them bubby mices, which is a grandparent's story. Like, what is your family story? Sharing your family story with your grandchild so that they keep the memory alive of people that they have never met, right? So keeping the memory alive of a grandparent talking about their parent, or a grandparent talking about their grandparent. It's a way of keeping the story and the experience and the spirit alive. So she says that Moses is the storyteller to the children of Israel, and brings a quote from Deuteronomy. But take utmost care and watch yourselves scrupulously, so that you do not forget the things that you saw with your own eyes, and so that they do not fade from your mind as long as you live. And make them known to your children and to your children's children. So they weren't the ones that experienced the story that Moses is talking about, but it was their parents. But Moshe here, Moses, is the Bubi Maisa here. He is the one in Deuteronomy that is telling the story of the Israel people to the next generations. Gail. Yeah. It's perfect. It was exactly where I was ending, which is that the Sisterhood years ago made a grandparent book, which is and now today there's also websites that do this and things like that, but the grandparent book, which is available in the Bethel gift shop, is a book of prompts that you can just fill out. And the idea is that it is an intergenerational passing on of story. And so it prompts us to capture our stories. It will remind us of stories that as we kind of dig deeper into our memory, and it really is a gift. So the gift of grandparenthood is truly special and sacred. That I think of my grandparents, and I don't know if I'll ever be a grandparent, but I know that if I should be fortunate to become one, that I will have an even fuller heart than I can imagine at this moment. Shabbat Shalom and Happy Mother's Day.